Jaime Lannister could still feel the sting of iron shackles digging into his wrists, chafing skin rubbed raw from months of captivity. But on this brisk, fog-laden morning, as he stood within the tent pitched on the wet grass of a war camp, that sting was as much a part of him as the scar on his cheek or the memory of distant battles. He was the Kingslayer, even if some preferred to call him the Lion of Lannister or Tywin's Golden Son. And though he stood captive in the camp of the northern rebels, his sword hand was still firmly attached to his arm's sleek, strong fingers that knew the weight of steel as intimately as they knew the warmth of a lover's body. He did not realize it then, but that simple fact would unravel every strand of fate that might have been. He had been snatched from the heart of the Whispering Wood, captured through cunning rather than brute force, and by all rights he should have died there. Perhaps it would have been better if he had. But the young wolf, Robb Stark, had chosen to keep him alive as a bargaining chip. Jaime felt the stench of rusted steel and damp wool swirl around him in the cramped tent. Even as he tried to stand tall, his shoulders ached from being slammed to the ground on more occasions than he cared to remember. He was not used to being at anyone's mercy. Lady Catelyn Stark stood before him, her grieving eyes flinty with a desperate determination. She asked him the same questions about her daughters, Sansa and Arya, where they were, what would become of them, and he offered the same smooth answers that, in truth, he only partially knew. They were in King's Landing, but Sansa was a pawn in the Lannister game while Arya's whereabouts were uncertain. Catelyn read him like a hawk assessing a field mouse. She saw his lies and half-truths, yet each time he managed to maintain that calm smirk. The damp wind rattled the walls of the tent like the ghost of some long-dead giant, and the flickering candlelight elongated their shadows against the canvas. Finally, the door flap opened to reveal Ser Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, and a pair of Northmen in wolf-emblazoned cloaks. The men stared Jaime down. Once, he might have demanded respect. Now, he wore the sweaty rags and bruises of a prisoner. Yet his posture was proud, his gaze unwavering. In silence, the old knight signaled for Jaime to be taken back to his makeshift cell among the trees. Someone tugged at the shackles with a sudden jerk, causing Jaime to wince. Still, he clenched his jaw and refused to give them the satisfaction of a groan. Outside, the sky was the color of old tin. The ground had become a swamp of mud and fallen pine needles. Jaime trudged through it, chains scraping along behind him, while the Northmen exchanged hushed curses about the Lannister host ravaging their lands. They hated him, that was certain. He was the face of their enemy, the symbol of their lost lords and burned villages. Yet he remembered with a wry sort of gratitude that they still feared him enough to watch his every step. Even caged, a lion could still bite. He was thrown into a pen of sturdy wooden stakes hammered into the muddy earth. There was little shelter, just enough to keep the worst of the rain off him, and inside, Brienne of Tarth. She, too, was a prisoner by a twist of fate, though she'd been sworn to guard Lady Catelyn. Something about a vow to return the Stark daughters in exchange for Jaime's release. Everything was tangled in the uncertain webs of alliances that bound the realm together and threatened to tear it apart. Brienne's eyes, a fervent blue in the gloom, met Jaime's with wary contempt as he stumbled into the enclosure. Jaime sank against the damp wood, feeling the ache in his muscles. Brienne kept her distance, tall and broad-shouldered in her drenched cloak. He recalled how she had bested him in a brief contest of blades when he'd first been freed under Lady Catelyn's misguided trust, only to find himself recaptured. Normally, the memory of defeat at the hands of any knight stung, but there had been something about the way she fought, fierce, steadfast, and honorable beyond reproach. He found it almost admirable. "They'll move us soon," Brienne said quietly, her voice low and throaty. "There's talk that Lord Bolton wants to take you to Harrenhal." Jaime's lips curled in a tight smile. "If I'm lucky, I'll see the inside of another cell. If I'm unlucky, I'll be served up to Robb Stark for the headsman's block. You're a fool to remain at my side, my lady. You'll gain nothing but trouble." She lifted her chin, defiance shining through the weariness in her eyes. "I gave my word. Besides, you were my charge." Those words, "you were my charge," pricked at Jaime's pride. How many people in the Seven Kingdoms would declare themselves the protector of the Kingslayer? The very notion almost made him laugh, but the laughter died in his throat. There was something unwavering in her sense of duty that he couldn't mock, at least not without feeling a twinge of shame for how hollow his own vows had become. Night descended, and the camp bustled with the hush of an army settling into uneasy rest. Soldiers cloaked in furs passed around weak ale and tents glowed with lantern light. Jaime closed his eyes, drifting in and out of a restless doze where he dreamt of clashing swords and roaring crowds. Occasionally he dreamed of King's Landing, the vast throne room, and the stench of burnt flesh lingering from the Mad King's final hours. In the darkest corners of his mind, he still saw wisps of wildfire. Each dream spattered him with the sticky blood of memory. Morning came, bleak and chill. A patrol of Bolton men separated Jaime from Brienne, and by midday they were on the march. The roads were miserable, thick mud up to their ankles, a sky threatening constant drizzle. Lords and knights rode on horseback, while Jaime trudged along on foot, still chained at the wrists. Each jolt of the chain served as a cruel reminder of his captivity. Yet he took small solace in the fact that his hand, at least, remained intact, ready to grasp a sword hilt should an opportunity arise. The caravan of soldiers, wagons, and prisoners trudged for days. Even the discipline of House Bolton's men couldn't tame the muck of the King's Road. At night, Jaime and Brienne slept under guard, so close and yet so far in their separate pens. Occasional glimpses across the dying campfires showed her sturdy silhouette, always awake, always alert. He suspected she worried for him in some odd sense, though he would never openly acknowledge it. When the tension in his shoulders grew unbearable, Jaime would shift and imagine being free, drawing steel, feeling that old rush that once made him so dangerous. But there was no chance, not yet, and so he waited. They arrived at Harrenhal beneath gray skies and the looming outline of melted towers. The fortress was a graveyard of ambition, scorched by dragonfire centuries ago. Its massive courtyards and cavernous halls felt vacant, haunted by ghosts of kings who never were. Roose Bolton, a pale man with unsettling eyes, had taken command of the place for the time being. He inspected Jaime the day they arrived, looking him over with a cool, measured expression, as though Jaime were a new piece on the game board. Bolton never raised his voice, never displayed anger or joy, which made him all the more terrifying. "You are Lord Tywin's son," Roose said quietly. "I expect you to be worth a great deal. He'll want you back in one piece, I imagine." Jaime's mouth twitched. "That depends on his mood and how much trouble I've caused him." Bolton regarded him for a long moment. We'll see." They were led deeper into Harrenhal's winding corridors, passing empty cells and damp, echoing halls. Jaime sensed this place was as cursed as the stories claimed, thick with a palpable gloom. Torches guttered in the drafty corridors, painting the blackened walls with dancing shadows. Bolton saw to it that Jaime and Brienne were quartered in rooms that were once used for storerooms. Better than a dungeon cell, but not by much. Neither tried to rest easy, for somewhere in those labyrinthine passages lurked the whispers of chaos. Days slipped into a slow pattern of dread, with Roose Bolton occasionally questioning Jaime on Lannister troop movements and alliances. Jaime volunteered few truths. He had been taught from childhood to guard family secrets. It was not for Roose Bolton's ears to know whether Tywin planned to crush the North or to broker a more cunning alliance. Jaime's guesses were as good as Bolton's anyway. Tywin always had multiple plans in motion, shifting like serpents in a pit. Jaime had never tried to keep up too closely with the old man's strategic mind. He'd been too busy chasing glory in the Kingsguard, betting women, and rising in renown as a swordsman. Now he half wished he had paid more attention. Brienne spent her hours in stony silence. On rare occasions, she and Jaime were permitted to take meager meals together under guard. She rebuffed any banter he tossed her way, but Jaime could sense her concern for Sansa Stark. She pressed him for details he did not fully have. He teased her with glimpses of rumors Sansa betrothed to Joffrey, or perhaps Sansa used as a bargaining chip. Brienne's lips would thin each time, as if the weight of failing her oath pressed down on her. Eventually, a turn came in their fortunes. Word reached Harrenhal that the tide of the war was shifting, that Tywin Lannister had bested Stannis Baratheon at King's Landing, and that the Tyrells were allied with the Iron Throne. The news crackled through the fortress like a spark in tinder. Roose Bolton, ever opportunistic, saw the chance to align with the stronger side. Rumors floated that he planned to head north and deal with rebellious lords while offering concessions to the Lannisters. Jaime found himself the most important coin in that negotiation. They would use him to buy favor with Tywin. Bolton's men outfitted Jaime in a decent tunic and breeches, though they kept him under watch. The plan, it seemed, was to escort Jaime to the edge of the Trident, perhaps under the guise of a prisoner exchange, maybe to release him for the Lannisters' gratitude. Brienne, tethered to Jaime by her vow to protect him, had no choice but to follow. The day they set out, the early morning sky burned red with the promise of uncertain weather. Jaime felt an undercurrent of anxious tension in every soldier's face. Something was about to shift. They rode out. Jaime was granted a horse this time, though his wrists were still shackled, the chain looped around the saddle. Brienne rode a stout mare beside him, her posture impossibly stiff. A detachment of Bolton men formed a perimeter around them. They traveled slowly, crossing fields that had borne the ravages of war. Farms were burnt husks, corpses still rotting in ditches. Carrion birds circled overhead. Jaime had seen war before. He had battled in sieges, led cavalry charges. But the scope of destruction always left a bitter taste in his mouth. Perhaps it was guilt or frustration at the futility of all the glorious battles that his father glorified. One evening, they made camp in the ruins of a small holdfast that had been razed. The walls still stood, but the roof was a blackened wreck. Jaime dismounted stiffly, his legs protesting after days in the saddle. Bolton's men quickly took positions, building fires in the courtyard. Brienne checked on the horses, her expression grim as she surveyed the devastation. Jaime walked the perimeter, the chain rattling with each step, and found a vantage point along what remained of a parapet. The setting sun cast long shadows across the rubble, and for a moment he imagined the place filled with laughter and the warmth of a family once living there. Such illusions vanished as quickly as they came. Brienne approached with her usual guarded manner. "We should stay close tonight. The roads aren't safe." Her voice was hushed, acknowledging the hush of the broken walls around them. Jaime turned, the golden curls of his hair catching the dying light. He could see the lines of fatigue under her eyes, though she did her best to hide it. "You're worried about bandits or raiders?" She nodded. "More than that. There are stories of brigands wearing the badges of wolves or lions, just excuses for pillaging. War draws the worst sorts." He met her gaze, searching her face. "And what if I told you I'd protect you as well, my lady? I still have one good sword hand after all." Then he lifted his shackled wrists, letting the iron links clink ironically. "Or I would if they let me." She frowned. "I can protect myself. You do better to conserve your strength should they turn on us." There was a note of sincerity behind her stoic features. Jaime almost laughed. Night spread cold and dark, the fires casting dancing shadows on the ragged walls. Boltons, half-frozen and weary, huddled together with bowls of thin stew. Jaime managed to choke some of it down, ignoring the lumps that might have been questionable meat. He caught Brienne's eyes from across the fire. She, too, swallowed her portion with grim acceptance. The smell of charred wood in the wreckage around them mingled with the pungent odor of sweat and horse manure. Sometime after midnight, a disturbance broke the uneasy silence. A lone scout came rushing into camp, shouting of movement beyond the ridgeline. Men scrambled to their feet. Weapons were drawn. Jaime's mind instantly flicked to the possibility that Robb Stark's outriders had found them, or perhaps bandits who dared to take on Bolton men. In either case, chaos loomed. He stretched his wrists, feeling the chain's restraint, wishing he had the freedom to draw steel. The Bolton soldiers formed up, lantern light cutting through the darkness as a handful of them moved to investigate. They disappeared around a crumbled wall, and for a tense moment, nothing stirred except the flickering shadows. Jaime strained his eyes, trying to see more. Brienne, sword unsheathed, stood near him, her shoulders squared, ready for anything. The night exploded in a sudden flurry of shouts and clashing steel. Dark shapes poured into the courtyard, raiders by the ragged look of them. They wore no sigils, or if they did, the fabric was torn beyond recognition. Their eyes glinted with the savage hunger of wolves. Bolton men rushed forward, swords and axes raised. The two groups met in a violent, dizzying clash. Firelight illuminated the spatter of blood, the frantic swirl of blades. Jaime backed away instinctively. He had no weapon, nothing but the shackles and chain. One of the raiders lunged at him, swinging a notched sword. Jaime twisted aside, hooking the chain around the man's arm with practiced speed, and yanked. The sword scraped across the ground as the raider stumbled, giving Jaime just enough time to slam his knee into the man's gut. Then he whipped the chain across the attacker's face. The raider collapsed, groaning. Jaime crouched to grab the dropped sword, but the chain was too short. It clanked taut around his saddle's pommel, anchored to the horse that had bolted in fear. Cursing, Jaime yanked fruitlessly at it, looking for a way to free himself. Brienne was upon the next raider, her stance wide, her sword slicing the air with lethal grace. She parried a slash aimed at her belly, pivoted, and slammed her shoulder into the attacker's chest. He staggered, and her blade found his throat. The man collapsed with a gurgling gasp. Another bandit came from behind, but she spun, her blade singing as it cleaved the assailant's arm. Jaime couldn't help but marvel at her skill. She fought with methodical precision, her face set in an expression of unbreakable focus. The Bolton soldiers fared less well in the initial surprise. Several lay dead or mortally wounded before they could mount a proper defense. But they were disciplined, and their superior numbers soon turned the tide. The raiders, seeing they could not claim an easy victory, began to retreat in disorganized clusters. Chaos reigned as men stumbled through the darkness, blades glinting sporadically in the firelight. In the confusion, a few raiders pressed forward, desperate to claim anything of value. One lunged for the saddlebags strapped to Jaime's frightened horse, slashing at the leather ties. The horse reared, nearly kicking Jaime's head. Jaime ducked low, struggling to control the chain that tethered him to the spooked animal. With a terrifying crack, the horse reared again. The chain jerked violently, pulling Jaime off his feet. He landed hard on his side in the churned mud. His ribs ached and his head spun, but he clung to the chain. The horse threatened to drag him, hooves thrashing. Jaime scrambled, searching desperately for a way to free himself. The clasps around his wrists were locked tight, and the chain's other end was fastened to the saddle. He cursed Tywin, cursed Bolton, cursed the entire wretched situation. All the while, men screamed and died around him. From the periphery of his vision, Jaime saw another raider approaching with a drawn dagger, intent on finishing him off. He tried to roll, but the chain pinned him. He kicked out, connecting with the raider's shin, but the man only stumbled back a step before regaining his balance. The dagger glinted, raised higher. Brienne's sword speared the man through the chest. He choked, eyes wide in shock, and collapsed in a heap beside Jaime. The blade withdrew with a wet sound. She glanced down at Jaime, panting, drenched in sweat and streaked with blood not her own. "Get up," she barked. Jaime spat mud and forced himself to his knees, the chain still taut. Brienne's gaze flicked to the horse that was now stamping in fear. Without hesitating, she stepped toward the maddened creature, murmuring calming words that Jaime could not hear over the din of retreating raiders. The horse snorted, eyes rolling, but it stilled enough for Brienne to yank the chain from the saddle ring. Free at last, Jaime scrambled upright. He snatched up the raider's dropped dagger, testing its weight in his hand. The courtyard was awash in the aftermath of the ambush. Scattered bodies, groans of pain, the flicker of half-burnt torches. Bolton men moved among the wounded, finishing off any survivors who resisted. The few remaining raiders had fled. Jaime glared at the chain that still dangled from his shackles. His wrists felt bruised and raw. He swallowed hard, glancing at Brienne. Blood trickled down her arm from a shallow cut, but her stance was still unyielding. "You saved me," he said, more in surprise than gratitude. "Seems you truly do keep your vows." She threw him a hard look. "If you die, I fail Lady Catelyn's trust. I will not fail." But there was a hint of relief in her eyes, a subtle sign of concern. Without waiting for him to respond, she turned away, searching the gloom for any remaining threats. Despite himself, Jaime was impressed. He'd been in more battles than he could count, but few fought as staunchly or with such unwavering purpose. The Bolton soldiers gathered around their wounded. Roose Bolton, it turned out, had not accompanied them personally. One of his captains led the escort. That captain was found among the dead, his throat torn open. With him gone, the remaining soldiers were leaderless. Whispers spread that, with no one in command, perhaps they should return to Harrenhal or seek out Lord Bolton for new orders. Amid the confusion, Jaime and Brienne bandaged what wounds they could. Jaime's ribs felt bruised, but no bones were broken. Brienne's arm was cut, though not deeply. They found a measure of water in a half-smashed barrel, enough to wash away the worst of the grime. Night's chill made them shiver, but they warmed themselves at a hastily rebuilt fire. Around them, the Bolton men argued about their next move. By dawn, a thin wisp of pale light revealed the ragged shape of the holdfast. Corpses lay stiffening in the courtyard. Crows had already gathered in the upper beams, cawing with hunger. Of the 24 Bolton men who started the journey, barely 15 remained. They had few horses left as well. Muttered voices carried on the wind. Some wanted to press onto the trident, deliver the prisoner, and be done with it. Others wanted to turn back to Harrenhal, regroup, and get fresh orders. Jaime watched them with half-lidded eyes, a faint smirk on his lips. He knew that in such times of turmoil, a lion could find his advantage. Brienne studied the men, scanning their battered faces. "They're more likely to kill each other than protect us," she murmured to Jaime. "We can't trust them." Jaime shrugged, stirring the embers of the fire with a broken bit of wood. "When have I trusted anyone in this war?" He eyed the chain that still hung from his shackles. "If they decide to ransom me straight to Tywin without consulting Bolton, I'll be safe enough, though I doubt they'll treat you with kindness. They might see you as a loose end." Her gaze hardened. "I made a vow." "Yes, you remind me every day." He paused, feeling an unexpected pang of conscience. "If they try to harm you, I'll do what I can. You did save me after all." Before she could respond, one of the Bolton men approached. He was a grizzled soldier with a scar running from temple to jaw. "We ride north," he declared. "We'll take the Kingslayer to the Twins, where Lord Bolton's allies may be. From there, we'll see him to King's Landing or wherever they bid us." Jaime rose, grimacing at the stiffness in his side. "You're sure crossing the Twins is wise? I hear Walder Frey doesn't welcome guests lightly these days." The soldier spat on the ground. "He'll welcome us. Lord Bolton has a pact, or so we were told. Gather your things." He nodded to Brienne as if she were just another foot soldier, ignoring the faint flicker of resentment in her eyes. They pressed on that morning, leaving the charred holdfast behind. The road took them across rolling plains dotted with the aftermath of war, burnt farms, abandoned wagons, broken arrows sprouting from the earth. They moved slowly, spurred on by the half-hearted discipline of men who had seen too much death. The days blurred in a monotony of cold camps and anxious watches. Jaime's wrists throbbed beneath the iron and Brienne's cut scabbed under a rough bandage. Neither complained aloud. Eventually, they came upon a small hamlet that had somehow escaped the worst of the conflict. A few huts clustered around a modest inn and a smithy. Chickens pecked in the muddy yard, and wide-eyed peasants stared from doorways as the armed band approached. The Bolton soldiers commandeered the inn, paying a pittance for stale bread and watery ale. The innkeeper was too frightened to refuse. Jaime slumped at a table, exhausted, while Brienne sat beside him, silently watching the men. One soldier brought in a blacksmith's hammer and a few iron tools. He gestured for Jaime to stand. "We'll fix that chain, make it easier for you to ride without tangling." Jaime's face was a mask of irony. On the one hand, he didn't want them tampering with his restraints. On the other hand, he was tired of stumbling around like a hobbled animal. So he rose, extending his shackled wrists. The blacksmith was a middle-aged man with soot-stained hands. He fiddled with the locks under the soldier's watchful eye. Moments later, a spark of light flickered off the metal as the blacksmith's hammer struck. Jaime felt an odd sense of release as the clamp unlatched, the chain dropping away from the saddle ring. But the soldier swiftly locked a new clasp in place, linking Jaime's wrists together in front of him so he had limited range of movement, but at least he wasn't tethered to a horse anymore. Once finished, the blacksmith glanced at Jaime's face, recognition briefly lighting his eyes. Perhaps he realized he was in the presence of the Kingslayer, the man whispered about in tavern corners as oathbreaker and murderer. Fear and fascination warred in the blacksmith's gaze, but he quickly looked away. That night, Jaime and Brienne managed a few hours of rest on the tavern's straw floor, blankets pulled around them. The Bolton men crowded together in the narrow space, reeking of sweat, ale, and the damp stench of worn leather. Jaime woke intermittently to the shuffle of boots and mumbled nightmares. He thought of Tyrion for a moment, wondering if his clever younger brother was safe in King's Landing after the battle. He thought of Cersei, too, though he knew better than to dwell on her in public. He missed the comfort of her presence, the secret they kept carefully hidden, or so they believed. Sleep eventually claimed him, restless but deep enough to escape the cold reality. Morning broke in a haze, the yard muddied by the trampling of horses. A light drizzle fell, chilling everyone to the bone. They set off once again, heading north, guided by rumors of Bolton's allies or the possibility of crossing paths with Frey bannermen. Each step deeper into the war-torn lands awakened Jaime's cynicism. The realm was a patchwork of scorched fields and battered strongholds, each brimming with resentment or fear. Men died for lords who played at thrones while the small folk suffered. Jaime had seen it all before, but captivity forced him to see it at eye level. It was not a vantage he relished. Weeks passed in this dreary routine until they stood at last on a hill overlooking the Twins. The castle spanned either side of the Green Fork, two identical keeps bridged by an ancient crossing. Flags bearing the sigil of House Frey. Two blue towers on gray fluttered in the wind. Jaime remembered the stories of Walder Frey, a prickly old man with many children and more grand ambitions than loyalty. The Bolton men seemed uneasy, though they tried to hide it. Crossing the twins required Lord Frey's permission, and such permission was never cheap. They approached the massive gates. Frey guards eyed them warily from the battlements. A few curt exchanges followed. Eventually, under threat of being turned away, the Bolton men parted with several gold dragons. Jaime did not miss the curses they muttered about the old lecher behind the walls. But business was business. The gates creaked open, allowing them into the courtyard that connected one of the twin keeps to the bridge. Lord Walder Frey himself did not deign to appear. Instead, one of his many sons or grandsons Jaime couldn't keep track came forth to greet them. The man had watery eyes, a nervous manner, and a voice that quavered when he spoke. "You travel under Lord Bolton's banner?" he asked. The Bolton soldiers nodded. "And you carry Jaime Lannister as your prisoner?" Another nod. The Frey man's eyes widened at Jaime's name. "The Kingslayer," he murmured with a mixture of awe and disgust. "Yes," one Bolton soldier said. "We seek to cross into the northern territories by Lord Bolton's orders to deliver him safely for negotiations." The Frey man sniffed. "Very well. You'll be granted passage, though you'll find the northern roads perilous. We have word that Robb Stark's forces still hold certain routes, and the Lady Catelyn," he paused. "Well, House Frey is carefully considering its alliances." Jaime swallowed a bitter remark. The memory of Catelyn Stark's fierce gaze returned to him, reminding him of how precariously he walked this line. Brienne stood behind him, silent as ever, her presence a steady anchor. They rested that night in a cramped common hall within the Frey keep. The air was thick with the smell of roasted onions, stale ale, and damp wool. Jaime half listened to the Bolton men negotiating with the Freys about provisions and rumored routes. He overheard something about an attack on Winterfell by the Ironborn, of all people, and an uproar among the northern lords. The realm was fracturing like a piece of fragile glass. He thought back to the carefree days of tourneys and feasts, how he'd once found it all so dull. Now, the memory seemed a distant dream. Brienne caught him brooding in a dark corner. "Our fates are tied to the whims of these men." "You must be careful," she said quietly. Jaime raised an eyebrow. "Worried for me, my lady?" Her face was unreadable. "I made a vow. If you die, so does my honor." He smirked. "And yet, you don't even like me, do you?" "I don't have to like you to keep my word." Despite her bluntness, there was something in her tone that wasn't as harsh as before. Jaime suspected that the heat of battle and the constant threat of betrayal had forged a certain uneasy respect between them. He had no illusions about what she thought of his past or his reputation, but they had saved each other's lives more than once. In this world of shifting alliances, that was something. Morning arrived and the caravan packed to depart. The Freys took their gold, lifted their gates, and let them cross the bridge spanning the Green Fork. The water below churned a murky greenish-brown, reflecting the tumult of the realm. Once they were on the other side, the journey continued north. The land gradually changed, the air growing sharper, the forests denser. Occasionally they passed travelers, scraggly merchants, or fleeing peasants who brought news of skirmishes and storms. Jaime gleaned from these encounters that Robb Stark was still undefeated in open battle, that the Ironborn were causing havoc in the western coast, and that Tywin Lannister was consolidating power in King's Landing with the Tyrells by his side. None of it surprised him, but it set him on edge, considering how quickly fortunes could shift. Days bled into more days, the monotony interrupted only by hunger, cold, and tension. The Bolton men proved a sullen lot, pressed on by duty more than loyalty. They had only so much food, so much patience. Jaime noticed them muttering to each other at the edges of campfires, occasionally eyeing Brienne like a wolf eyes a stray ewe. He kept close watch, for though he was hampered by the shackles, he still had his hand. In a pinch, he could at least try to defend her if they turned. One evening, a storm broke overhead, drenching them in freezing rain. The group took shelter in a derelict barn on a rundown farm. The roof leaked and the wind howled through the gaps. The guards built a small fire in the center, smoke curling up into the rafters. Brienne found a corner to lay down her cloak, while Jaime settled beside her, arms crossed to preserve warmth. Outside, thunder rumbled like distant drums of war. It was then that one of the older Bolton men, battered, bruised, with a face drawn tight from hunger, approached Jaime. He crouched down, leaning in close. "We know you're worth a ransom," the man said under his breath. "But I wonder if we'll see a single gold dragon for our trouble, especially if Lord Bolton has changed his plans. Perhaps we should sell you to the highest bidder ourselves. Or send your head to Tywin with a message." Jaime's eyes narrowed. "I imagine my father pays better for living sons." The soldier shrugged. "Perhaps, but the road's grown long and my men grow restless. Most of us have families back in the Dreadfort or along the Weeping Water. They expect us to return with spoils." Brienne stirred. You'll get no ransom if you kill him. The soldier eyed her. Who's to say Tywin wouldn't pay just to see his son buried with Lannister honors? Lords do stranger things in times of war. Jaime felt a stab of genuine fear, tempered by the flicker of defiance that always kept him alive in dire moments. We both know you're safer keeping me alive until a clearer path emerges. You kill me, you lose all bargaining power. The man's lips twisted in a humorless smile. Perhaps. Or perhaps we can weigh our options. He rose slowly, stepping back into the shadows. As the night wore on, the rain continued to lash the barn roof. Jaime's mind whirled with possibilities. He could sense the shift in the soldiers' mood. They had lost too many men, and House Bolton's position in the war was no longer secure. Who was left to reinforce them? Who would punish them if they went rogue and simply ransomed Jaime for their own ends? Before dawn, the choice was made for them. A small band of riders appeared, bearing torches that flickered through the storm. They wore the direwolf sigil of House Stark. Somehow, Robb Stark's men had tracked or stumbled upon them. The Bolton men leaped to their feet, cursing, swords drawn. Brienne also armed herself, eyes flicking to Jaime. He stood as well, shackled but ready. Shouts rang out in the dark, punctuated by flashes of steel. The Stark riders sought to take the Bolton men by surprise, but the barn's defenders fought back doggedly. Horses screamed, men yelled in pain. Jaime, with nothing but shackled hands, found himself pressed against the barn wall, searching for a dropped weapon. He spied a dead Bolton soldier near the doorway, his sword, slick with blood, lay inches away. Jaime dove for it, ignoring the jolt of pain in his bruised ribs. He grasped the hilt with both bound hands, awkwardly lifting it in time to parry a wild slash from a mounted Stark rider. The clash jolted up his arms, but he held firm. He saw Brienne engaged with two Stark soldiers, her blade weaving in controlled arcs. Rain plastered her hair to her face, and her cloak billowed, but she fought with unwavering determination. One soldier tried to feint low, only to be knocked off balance by her parry, and she delivered a brutal strike that sent him sprawling. The Bolton men were soon overwhelmed. The few who remained realized that they were caught between a superior force and certain death. One soldier screamed that he surrendered, but a Stark arrow took him in the throat. Jaime grit his teeth, brandishing his sword in a last effort to keep the attackers at bay. "Hold! Hold!" shouted a commanding voice through the rain. A figure dismounted, a tall, lean man with gray eyes and a streak of white in his dark hair. He surveyed the carnage, then his gaze landed on Jaime. "The Kingslayer," he said, voice heavy with contempt. Jaime recognized him as one of Robb Stark's banner men, perhaps a trusted knight or lord. He swallowed, adrenaline roaring in his veins. "Do you intend to take me back to the young wolf?" Jaime asked, struggling to keep his voice steady above the storm. The man's expression was grim. "Aye, that I do. Robb Stark will decide your fate. We had heard rumor you were with Bolton men. I see they tried to sell you down the river, or so it seems." Brienne lifted her sword, pointing it at the man. "I made an oath to return him safely to King's Landing in exchange for Lady Catelyn's daughters. You have no right to take him." The knight's lip curled. "Catelyn Stark is not here. And if she were, I doubt she'd trust you over her own son's judgment." He waved a hand and two of his men moved to seize Jaime. Brienne moved to interpose herself. "You'll not," she began, but before she could finish, 3 Stark men surrounded her, weapons raised. She fought back, but they disarmed her with careful coordination, obviously reluctant to kill her but equally determined to restrain her. A blow to her side made her gasp, and they forced her to her knees in the mud. Jaime felt the tip of a spear pressed against his back. "Don't," warned one of the soldiers. "Lay down the sword." Gritting his teeth, Jaime slowly let the sword slip from his fingers. It sank into the muddy ground. He glanced around at the bodies littering the barn, Bolton men, and a few Stark riders. The survivors glowered at him, the memory of the blood they had spilled fresh in their minds. It was easy to see them wanting to end the Kingslayer's life right then and there. Yet they refrained, their discipline holding. Jaime stood motionless, feeling the rain drip into his eyes and the spear point digging into his shoulder blade. The commanding knight surveyed the dead, then turned to Jaime and Brienne. "Bind them. We ride at dawn, taking them to Riverrun. The king in the north will decide their fates." Jaime spared a quick glance at Brienne, who struggled under the grip of 2 soldiers. Their eyes met, and he saw frustration, no, fury burning in her face. She had risked everything to keep him alive for that vow. Now it was out of their hands. Bound again, with ropes supplementing his shackles, Jaime was forced to march alongside the Stark riders. Brienne walked near him, similarly restrained. The cold morning air stung. The storm had passed, leaving behind a morass of mud. The path west would lead them eventually to Riverrun, seat of House Tully, Catelyn Stark's birthplace and, at present, Robb Stark's base of operations. Jaime recalled the last time he'd been within those walls. He was an honored guest turned captive, a man whose name was spoken in curses. Now he would return in even worse circumstances, his father's war raging, the North still thirsting for vengeance. Though every muscle in Jaime's body begged for rest, fear and defiance kept him alert. He cast sidelong looks at the men who rode nearby, assessing their readiness, their vigilance. A part of him still yearned for a desperate chance to flee. But the memory of the ambush at the barn and the savage efficiency with which these men fought dampened that spark. He was no fool, he could kill a few perhaps, but not all. Brienne, too, scanned for openings, but the soldiers gave her none. Their circle was tight, and they remained ever watchful. She winced occasionally, favoring her side where she'd been struck. Jaime sensed her anger simmering. She had given her word to Catelyn, had endured countless trials to see him safe. Now it seemed all for nothing. The days that followed were harsh. They had little time to rest, forced to cover as much ground as possible. The Stark riders wanted to avoid any run-ins with Lannister or Bolton patrols, weaving through less traveled routes. Jaime's wrists chafed worse than ever, and his ribs felt as though they might crack each time he coughed. Brienne, sturdy as she was, also showed signs of fatigue, but she soldiered on, a silent pillar of resolve. If she felt any despair, she hid it well. At last, Riverrun's walls rose in the distance. Jaime recognized the twin gatehouses, the river moat. Though the Tully fish banners now flew beside the dire wolf of House Stark, it still bore the same stately look he remembered. Memories flooded back of a younger Jaime riding into Riverrun for a tourney, hoping to impress the ladies with his skill in the lists. That seemed a different lifetime, another world. Now, battered and bound, he was little more than a prize of war. Word spread quickly inside the castle that the Kingslayer had been brought in. Tully and Stark soldiers gathered, muttering in the courtyard as Jaime and Brienne were led toward the keep. Jaime steeled himself for the sight of Robb Stark. The young wolf was said to be a capable commander, victorious in battle after battle. Jaime had fought him once, underestimating him at the Whispering Wood, and had paid for it with captivity. He would not repeat that mistake. But instead of Robb, they were greeted by Lady Catelyn Stark on the keep steps. Her face was worn with grief, lines etched by a mother's heartbreak. She gazed at Jaime, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to Brienne, and something flickered in her eyes, relief, perhaps, that Brienne still lived. But it was tempered by sorrow and confusion. "Where is my son?" Jaime asked, breaking the tense silence. Catelyn's gaze shifted to him. "He is not here. He rides east, dealing with matters of the war." Her voice held a quiet steel. "Until he returns, you shall remain a prisoner. Both of you." She turned to Brienne. "What happened?" "You were to return my daughters in exchange for him." Brienne swallowed. "Lady Stark, I did as you asked. I kept him safe, but there were ambushes, betrayals. I did not reach King's Landing. Your daughters. I do not know their fates. I failed you." Lady Catelyn's lips tightened. "I see." She glanced at Jaime, bitterness swimming in her eyes. "Is my daughter Sansa still wed to that boy king?" Jaime shook his head. "She's not wed yet. Betrothed to Joffrey, though the date has likely changed. Your other daughter, Arya, we have not heard from in some time." He spoke truthfully, seeing no point in deception. "I'd rather not lie if I can help it. It only complicates things." Catelyn laughed, a humorless sound. "And I am to trust the Kingslayer?" She closed her eyes briefly, collecting herself. "Take them to the cells. I will decide what is to be done." They were led away deeper into the castle. Guards escorted them along corridors lit by flickering torches. Finally, Jaime found himself in a familiar place, one of Riverrun's lower dungeons, though a reasonably clean one by dungeon standards. The guard unlocked the iron gate and Jaime was shoved inside. Brienne was placed in the adjacent cell. The heavy door clanged shut. In the dim torchlight, Jaime sank onto a small wooden bench, exhaling as the tension of the journey left his shoulders. The stone walls pressed in, cold and damp, but it was still better than the muddy wilderness. Through the bars, he saw Brienne settle onto a straw pallet. Their eyes met and a silent understanding passed between them. They had survived this far together, each driven by oaths and necessity. Fate had them caged once again, uncertain if they would see freedom or a swift end. Days passed in the gloom. Sometimes Catelyn Stark came to question Jaime, asking again about her daughters. Jaime told her what he knew, which was little. Her frustration at her powerlessness showed in her clenched jaw and the sorrow that lingered in her eyes. She did not speak to Brienne as much, but Jaime sensed her inner conflict. She had asked Brienne to do the impossible. Brienne had tried and failed, but at no fault of her own. War had a way of shredding the best of intentions. For Jaime, the days in the cell turned into a kind of quiet torment. He had grown used to more open captivity, a chance to move, to ride. Now he was confined once more, his only companion the echo of water dripping in the corridor. Food was meager but sufficient. He suspected Catelyn Stark was not cruel by nature. She wanted him alive, if only for leverage. Some nights, Jaime would wake to his own ragged breathing, heart pounding with nightmares. He would recall the day he slew the Mad King, how Aerys' eyes bulged with betrayal and fear, the stench of wildfire in the air. No matter how many times he told himself that killing Aerys had saved thousands, the realm insisted on condemning him as an oathbreaker. He found he could no longer muster the same smug indifference as before. Brienne's cell offered a small view of the corridor, and occasionally Jaime glimpsed her speaking with someone. A servant, perhaps. She asked for news of Sansa or for permission to see Catelyn Stark again. Most times, the guard dismissed her. Jaime admired her tenacity, though he would never openly say so. At last, on a day that smelled of fresh rain filtering through the upper windows, Catelyn Stark stood before Jaime's cell once more. Her face was ashen with news she had received. "Robb has suffered betrayals," she told him in a trembling voice. "The Freys have broken faith. My son, he must now appease them, or war will end us all." Jaime stood, pressing his hands against the bars. "Then you need me, my lady, more than ever. Tywin will want me back, and in return he will." She silenced him with a scathing glare. "I will not yield to Tywin Lannister. I simply wish to see my daughters safe." Then she turned to Brienne's cell. "As for you, you did not complete your mission, yet I believe you tried. I cannot say what my son will decide when he returns. For now, you remain a prisoner of House Stark." Jaime's frustration boiled. "If you want your daughters, you'll need me alive and in King's Landing. My father will trade. Even that wretch Joffrey might see sense in returning Sansa for me, if only to save face. Arya, wherever she is, my father would at least claim to help find her to secure me." Catelyn's eyes brimmed with tears she fought to contain. "You think I haven't considered it? But the war is beyond reason. Robb wants victory, and your father wants power. In the midst of it all, my daughters are lost." She paused, then turned away, her voice hollow. "I will speak with you both again once my son returns." She departed, leaving Jaime and Brienne alone with the echo of footsteps. Outside the narrow window, the sky darkened with the approach of night. Jaime rested his forehead against the cold iron bars, feeling a knot of despair twist inside him. He had once lived for battle, for the prestige of the Kingsguard, for the love he hid in secret. Now he lived day to day, reliant on the mercy of those who despised him. Yet in the darkness of that dungeon, he felt a faint, unbidden surge of determination. He still had his hand, still possessed his skill with a blade should an opportunity arise. Perhaps that was enough to change fate. He heard Brienne's voice from the adjacent cell, low and resolute. "I will find a way," she said. Jaime didn't answer immediately, but he met her gaze through the bars. In her eyes, he saw the reflection of his own battered will. If there was a chance to escape, to regain freedom, even if it meant forging an uneasy alliance with her, he would take it. For though the realm might call him Kingslayer, he had no intention of kneeling to the chains of destiny without a fight. And so the wheels of the future turned, irrevocably changed by the simple fact that Jaime Lannister's sword hand still remained upon his wrist, steady and ready for whatever storm would come next. Time dulled the edges of despair, but it did not snuff out Jaime Lannister's determination. Day after day he remained in the Riverrun dungeons, with Brienne confined in the next cell. Torchlight revealed the faint contours of her face, stoic and intent. She used the hours to pace like a caged animal, her mind clearly turning over every possibility for escape or negotiation. Jaime, for his part, kept a tight rein on his own thoughts. He was the Kingslayer, scorned by the realm, but he still had his sword hand, and with that came the chance, even the promise, that he might yet free himself from these chains. He was not tortured. No jailers came to thrash him or starve him. If anything, Catelyn Stark's sense of honor showed itself in how he was treated. The food was plain but clean, bread and porridge with an occasional cup of watered wine. A guard would arrive daily, sometimes checking the manacles on Jaime's wrists, other times bringing a crust of bread for Brienne. Now and again, Lady Catelyn herself visited, always with that worn, resolute expression. She reminded Jaime of a tall oak battered by storms, upright, unyielding, but etched with sorrow. Her questions rarely changed. Did he have any new information about Sansa or Arya? Could he guarantee their safety if he were freed? Jaime answered as best he could, weaving half-truths into something that might offer her a sliver of hope. In truth, he knew little. At King's Landing, the Lannisters hoarded power, and Tywin would certainly not give up his advantage for nothing. But if there was a bargain to be struck, Catelyn might find it in her heart to let him go. Brienne's oath hung between them all like a vow etched on steel. She insisted that if they could just reach the capital, Catelyn might yet see her daughters returned. Jaime suspected it was not so simple. A cornered lion could be dangerous, and Tywin Lannister was cornered by the war that demanded either a crushing victory or a cunning negotiation. Yet, Jaime knew how the game was played. His father would prefer a trade so long as it did not diminish Lannister prestige or compromise the throne. Perhaps if Robb Stark's rebellion could be tempered, Sansa might be returned. As for Arya, even Jaime had to admit he had no real clue where the girl was. She had not been seen in King's Landing since the day of Ned Stark's execution. Jaime occasionally felt a pang, how young she must have been, lost in a realm at war. He tried not to show how heavily his captivity wore on him. Each night, he drifted into half-remembered dreams of the White Sword Tower in King's Landing, of his early days as a Kingsguard knight brimming with naive pride. Then the dreams always twisted. Returning to that day, he slew Aerys Targaryen. The stench of burned flesh and the echo of the Mad King's ravings filled his mind. He awoke in darkness, lips parted, sweat cold on his skin. At such times, he would sense Brienne awake in her own cell. She never asked about his nightmares, and he never spoke of them. An understanding had sprung up between them, though no words named it. They were both caged, and each recognized that the other's resilience was all they had left. Weeks passed, or perhaps months. Time was difficult to measure in the dungeon's gloom. Jaime's injuries from the raids and forced marches slowly healed, leaving behind scars and aches. Brienne's cut across her arm scabbed over, though she winced at times if she moved too abruptly. They learned the guard rotations by heart. 4 men in the morning, 4 in the afternoon, 2 at night. Sometimes they recognized a friendly face, a soldier who might toss them an extra crust of bread. Other times, the guards were openly hostile, spitting insults about the Kingslayer or calling Brienne an oath-breaking wench. Neither Jaime nor Brienne rose to that bait. Anger served no purpose when there was no sword in hand. At long last, the arrival of Robb Stark shattered the listless routine. Trumpets sounded in the main courtyard, muffled by the layers of stone and earth, but still audible. The fortress bustled. Soldiers hurried to their posts, and at least once Jaime caught a glimpse of Robb's direwolf, Grey Wind, prowling in the courtyard outside a high window. The beast's low growl carried even through thick walls. Jaime felt a rare flicker of apprehension. He had fought men all his life, but direwolves were another matter. His own family sigil was a golden lion. He knew the threat a beast could pose, particularly if it was bound heart to heart with its master. Finally, the day came. Jaime heard the jangle of many keys. The dungeon door creaked open, and torches flared, revealing a cluster of Northmen led by none other than Robb Stark himself. He was young, far younger than Jaime had once been when he joined the Kingsguard, but there was a composure about him, a gravity. His eyes were the same gray as his late father's, though tinged with an anger that Ned Stark once tried to keep leashed. Catelyn followed behind her son, her expression pained. Several guards accompanied them, armed with spears and swords. Jaime straightened from his perch on the bench, ignoring the jolt of discomfort in his legs. He tried to mask his tension with a faint smirk. "So the king in the north graces me with a visit," he said, letting sarcasm drip from his tone. Robb's jaw tightened. "I have not come for idle talk, Kingslayer. You sit here as my prisoner. My mother tells me she considered a trade for my sisters, but I have lost too much to trust your father's word." Jaime inclined his head slightly. "So have we all lost too much? If you mean to kill me, do it. If you mean to ransom me, do that. Keeping me here, starved for news and locked in a hole, accomplishes nothing." Rob's gaze flicked to Brienne in the next cell. She stood calm but watchful. He turned back to Jaime. I want to hear your account of how my father died. My mother says you claim to have no part in it, but your name is cursed for a reason. Speak plainly. His voice was cold steel. Jaime's heart beat faster. He did not want to recount that day on the Great September Steps, the shock on Ned Stark's face when Joffrey demanded his head. Yet he also knew that telling the story truthfully might forge a thin path to trust. He drew in a steadying breath, glancing at Catelyn. She watched him with parted lips, perhaps remembering the horror of it all. With measured words, Jaime explained how Ned Stark was arrested for treason after revealing the secret of Joffrey's parentage. He told how Ned offered a false confession in exchange for mercy, how Joffrey, impulsive and eager for blood, ordered the headsman to strike. He described how he himself was not present for the final blow, but how he heard later that it was Island Payne who swung the sword on Joffrey's direct command. At no point, Jaime said, did he raise a blade against Ned Stark. He was not proud of the fact that he had not tried to stop the execution. He admitted as much, but left no doubt that the deed was the Boy King's alone. Robb listened, rigid, eyes flicking with anger and sadness. Catelyn's face was pale, tears shimmering at the edges of her lashes. When Jaime finished, the king in the north said nothing for several heartbeats. He finally exhaled as though wrestling with a tumult of emotion. That does not absolve you of your other crimes, he said. Murdering the Mad King, betraying your vows. Jaime's old bitterness flared. That Mad Anne would have burned the city, burned your precious father and all his men. You would not be standing here if he'd had his way. Call me Oathbreaker if you wish, but I saved 500,000 people when I killed Aerys. Robb's eyes hardened. It is not my place to judge the Targaryen's sins. But your vow is to protect your king. You broke that vow? Perhaps you had reasons. But to many lords, you're no better than a rabid dog. Jaime almost laughed. Then either put me down or let me go. Keeping me in a cage proves nothing. Robb lifted his chin. I will consider it. His gaze shifted to Brienne. And you. My mother once trusted you to see this man to King's Landing in exchange for my sisters. You failed. Should I hold you to account for that? Brienne did not flinch. I swore to Lady Stark I would do all in my power to return her daughters. I still swear it. War intervened. I was taken prisoner. I could not keep traveling. But if you grant me leave, I will finish what I began. Or die trying. Catelyn spoke up then, voice unsteady. Robb, I believe Brienne acted in good faith. We have had no word from King's Landing about the girls. There is no reason to think they've been harmed, aside from Sansa's betrothal. But Arya, we remain in the dark. She paused, emotion thick in her throat. If Brienne can somehow secure Sansa's release, or even find Arya, is that not worth the risk? Robb's stance wavered. He wanted to be the fearless king in the north, but his mother's sorrow plainly affected him. You ask me to let my greatest hostage, the Kingslayer, walk free? He said quietly, turning to face her. How many thousands of Northmen have died because of Tywin Lannister? How many more will die if I simply hand Jaime over for a promise? Catelyn laid a trembling hand on her son's arm. If it secures the girl's safety, can you weigh that against the vengeance we seek? I have lost my husband. I cannot bear to lose my daughters. Please. Robb hesitated. The silence in the dungeon felt as heavy as an anvil. Jaime sensed that this was the moment. Everything hinged on the king in the north's decision. One nod and Jaime might be free. One scowl and he would remain to rot until the war ended in fire. His heart thudded in his chest, but he forced himself to maintain that indifferent, almost mocking expression. The young king's voice, when it came, was measured. You place me in an impossible position, mother. To release him is an insult to the lords who have fought for us, to the families who have lost fathers and sons. I cannot simply free the man who tried to kill Bran, who waged war on our banners. Jaime's breath caught. I never tried to kill your brother. Those were the rumors. I had no hand in sending any assassin. Robb's glare sliced through him. You pushed Bran from a tower. He told us. Whether you intended him dead or not, the act remains. A barbed hush drew across Jaime's thoughts. Of course Bran Stark remembered who had shoved him. Yet, the deeper reason behind that act, Jaime and Cersei together in the tower, was not something he could ever reveal. Not if he valued his sister's life and his own. So he said nothing. He let his silence become an admission of guilt in their eyes. Robb pressed his lips together. You see why I cannot simply let you go. But I will not let you remain idle either, stirring up trouble in my dungeons. I will speak to my advisors. For now, you both remain here. Guard them well, he ordered his men, and see they come to no harm. With that, the king in the north turned, cloak sweeping the dusty floor. Caitlin cast one final glance at Jaime, something torn between pity and exasperation, before following her son out into the corridor. The heavy door clanged shut. Their torches receded, leaving the cells dimly lit once more by only a sputtering sconce on the wall. Brienne sank onto her pallet, shaking her head. It is as I feared. He is too angry to trust you. Jaime allowed himself a bitter laugh. Rightfully so, I suppose. I did push his brother out a window. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. If that ever becomes public knowledge, it'll be my head on a spike for sure, even if the war ended tomorrow. Brienne's gaze held no sympathy, merely a grim acceptance that matched his own. Then our only hope is for Lady Caitlyn's desperation to outweigh her son's fury. She wants her daughters back. So do I, Jaime murmured, surprising himself. At Brienne's startled look, he shrugged. Their innocence. Sansa's a child forced into the den of vipers, and Arya. By the gods, the last place I saw her was in the chaos of the Red Keep's yard, if my memory serves. She vanished like smoke. I can't claim I ever spared her more than a passing thought, but if the girl ends up a casualty in this wretched war, that's one more stain on my soul. It would be simpler if she reappeared, safe and sound. Brienne studied him in silence. Jaime wondered if she saw the flicker of genuine remorse in his eyes. He doubted it mattered. Her sense of duty was forged in steel, unwavering. Whether she believed he had a scrap of honor left was almost beside the point. The vow bound her, and that vow meant delivering Jaime so that the Stark girls could be returned. Nothing else was relevant to her sense of right and wrong. Time ground on. Over the next few days, word filtered down that Robb Stark and his advisors debated Jaime's fate behind closed doors. Riverrun's corridors rang with arguments. Jaime gleaned from scraps of overheard conversation that certain lords, namely the great Jon Umber and the Karstarks, clamored for Jaime's immediate execution. They blamed him for everything from Ned Stark's beheading to the burning of northern villages, though those acts, in truth, largely belonged to Tywin and Gregor Clegane. Others, including some of the Tully men, urged caution, seeing Jaime as a valuable bargaining chip. Lord Edmure Tully, Caitlyn's brother, was said to be vexed by the entire predicament, more concerned with the Riverrun and safety than making deals with Lannisters. When the decision came, it arrived in the form of a reluctant compromise. One evening, while Jaime idly counted the drip of water from the ceiling, the dungeon door opened and Caitlyn reappeared. She was alone, save for two silent guards. Her face was wan with tension, and she gripped the bars of Jaime's cell. "My son has decided not to execute you, for now," she said in a hushed tone, as though aware the walls had ears. "Nor does he trust me to send you on your way to King's Landing. He fears that letting you go would weaken his alliances, that the Karstarks might rebel entirely." Jaime breathed in slowly. "Then I remain a prisoner?" "Not exactly. His advisors believe you might be of use in another way. There is talk of prisoner exchanges beyond just my daughters. Lord Karstark demands justice for his sons killed by Lannister blades, and so he seeks your blood. But if a trade can be arranged that satisfies the Northmen, we might yet see Sansa returned. Arya, if she can be found too." Jaime frowned. "I fail to see how any trade is possible unless I am physically brought to a neutral ground. My father will not release Sansa and search for Arya without proof that I am there to be handed over." Caitlyn swallowed. "Exactly. You may not go free, but Robb will arrange for you to be transported. The negotiations will happen in carefully selected territory not far from the twins, if word from Lord Frey can be trusted at all." A flicker of surprise crossed Jaime's face. "So the king in the north trusts Walder Frey to host a negotiation? I'd sooner trust a viper not to strike my ankle." "He has little choice," Caitlyn said, her tone reflecting her own reluctance. "House Frey's betrayal cost us dearly. They want to mend that rift, or so they claim, and my son hopes to salvage the alliance. Or at least secure safe passage for an exchange." Brienne joined them at the bars, frowning. "When does this journey begin?" "In a fortnight," Caitlyn replied. "Travel routes must be scouted. The Karstarks must be appeased enough not to sabotage the exchange. Robb is riding out with a contingent of his best men to ensure no ambush can occur. Until then, you remain here. Come the day of departure, you'll be placed under heavy guard." Jaime let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. A fortnight more of these walls, but then at least a glimmer of progress. "And if the trade fails?" Caitlyn's voice was barely above a whisper. "If it fails, Robb will see you executed. The Northmen will accept no further delays." She turned her gaze on Brienne. "I am sorry it has come to this. You kept your word as best you could, but the war has outpaced all good intentions." Brienne bowed her head. "I understand, my lady. We must do what we can, however small." Caitlin pressed her lips into a thin line as though sealing off tears she could not afford to show. Then she nodded to the guards, and they left as quietly as they'd come. The fortnight passed in excruciating slowness. Each day, Jaime could almost taste the tension in the air. Riverrun's courtyards bustled with preparations. Wagons loaded, fresh horses groomed, lines of steel-clad soldiers drilling under the castle walls. Sometimes, through the narrow window high on the dungeon wall, Jaime caught glimpses of the sky turning from gray to a bruised purple at dusk. He yearned to feel fresh wind on his face again. Brienne spent hours in silent reflection, occasionally testing her bound wrists against the iron manacles, though never so violently as to risk the guards' wrath. The date of their departure loomed, half hopeful and half ominous. At last the day arrived. The guards came at dawn, unbolting the cell doors. Jaime was yanked upright, the chain on his manacles rattling. Brienne emerged from her cell with shoulders squared, letting them bind her wrists more securely. Up the winding steps they went, emerging into the open courtyard. Jaime blinked against the sudden brightness. Early sunlight gleamed on the walls of Riverrun, casting long shadows across the ground. Soldiers milled about, harnessing horses to wagons, adjusting saddles and fastening packs. Jaime's eyes flicked around, assessing. He had no illusions of easy escape. Too many men with swords, and he was unarmed, both hands shackled. But simply breathing open air felt like a small victory. Brienne took in her surroundings with a more measured calm. A bruise marred her cheekbone, a souvenir from the last attempt by overzealous Karstark guards to soften her into talking. She had told them nothing. Jaime felt a momentary surge of admiration for her stoicism. Not many knights, male or female, could endure such humiliations and remain unbroken. Robb Stark stood near the stables, conferring with several lords. Grey Wind, his direwolf, paced at his side, ears pricked with alertness. When Jaime was brought closer, the beast let out a low rumble that made the hair on Jaime's neck stand on end. Every instinct told him not to move too quickly, not to provoke the direwolf's predatory gaze. Robb turned, noticing Jaime and Brienne, and raised a hand to still his companion. "We leave shortly," he told Jaime, voice curt. "My mother will travel with us as well, though my men will form the main escort." Jaime's gaze slid to Caitlin. She stood behind her son, clad in a heavy cloak for the road. Her posture was tense, her face drawn. He gave the barest nod of acknowledgement. She did not return it. Instead, she looked past him at the wagons. They soon mounted. Jaime was not permitted to ride freely. The guards locked his chains to a stirrup ring, forcing him to share a horse with a Northman in front, while another soldier held the reins. Brienne rode double as well, similarly bound. The arrangement was humiliating but practical from the northern perspective. They would not risk the Kingslayer galloping away on a stolen mount. Soldiers fanned out in formation, spears glinting in the cold sunlight, and the entourage moved out of Riverrun's gates. Traveling with a large host meant slow progress. Roads had turned to mud in places. The wet spring had teased the earth into thick ruts and puddles that the horses splashed through. At times, they caught glimpses of farmland along the Red Fork. Some fields were sprouting new green shoots, the farmers hoping for a respite from war. Others lay scorched, with charred beams marking where a homestead once stood. Jaime watched crows circle overhead, scavenging on the realm's tragedies. He tried to shut out the memory of carnage he had witnessed. He had never considered himself squeamish, but captivity had changed his perspective. He saw how the war's ripple effect hammered everyone, not just knights in armor. When they halted for the night, the Northmen set up a tight perimeter of tents. Brienne and Jaime were locked in separate canvas enclosures, each with 2 guards standing watch. Once, while the guards conferred or cursed about the meager rations, Jaime heard Robb's direwolf growling somewhere in the darkness. He pictured the beast prowling among the tents, sniffing for intruders. Even in the gloom, the Northmen carried that air of readiness, as if waiting for an ambush. On the 3rd day of travel, the host was forced to ford a swollen tributary. Wagons strained against the current, horses stumbled over unseen rocks, and the entire endeavor took the better part of the day. Jaime's boots were soaked through, and a foul mood settled over many. Brienne, if she felt any discomfort, revealed little, though now and then Jaime noticed her jaw tighten as the icy water seeped up to her knees. She was not immune to the cold, just adept at pushing it aside. Jaime marveled at her endurance, recalling the heated training yards of the Red Keep where knights boasted of their prowess. Many of them, he guessed, would have complained loudly in her position. They continued eastward, the scenery shifting to gentle hills and scattered woodlands. At night, Jaime overheard talk around the fires. The men spoke of the phrase, how Walder Frey had once promised them safe passage but betrayed Robb Stark at the Twins. There was mention of a wedding, a massacre, whispers that never quite took form into complete stories. Jaime knew enough to guess that something terrible had happened with House Frey. He recalled rumors that Robb had broken a marriage pact to wed Talisa Maegor, a foreigner from Volantis, which outraged Walder Frey. Whether that was the cause or the result of the betrayal, Jaime did not know for certain. He only knew that the Northmen spat on the ground at any mention of the phrase. And yet, paradoxically, they were forced to deal with them again. War made strange bedfellows, or so the saying went. They approached a crossroads where the road diverged north to the Twins or east along the Trident. Here, the host paused. Scouts rode ahead to confirm the route was safe. Robb Stark gathered his officers along with Catelyn. At a distance, Jaime watched from where he was tethered to a post, wanting to glean some sense of their plans. The conversation was hushed, but the tension on the air was palpable. Finally, the group dispersed. Robb approached Jaime personally, gray wind padding at his side. The direwolf's yellow eyes locked on Jaime's wrists as if it understood exactly who he was. "We head north," Robb said. "Lord Walder Frey has agreed to host a parley. My envoys say Tywin Lannister might send a representative to treat for your release. We shall see if that rumor proves true. My mother believes he will." Jaime forced a cool smile. "My father seldom lets an opportunity slip by. He will come or send his man if only to look you in the eye before cutting a deal." Robb studied him with an inscrutable gaze. "We'll reach the Twins in 4 days if the roads hold. You'll be placed in the keep's tower until the parley is arranged. If the negotiations fail, if this is a trap from your father, know that I won't hesitate to execute you." "Is that clear?" "Perfectly," Jaime drawled. "I hope for your sake that you can keep Lord Frey from turning his cloak again. I suspect he's as slippery as an eel." Without reply, Robb walked away, his dire wolf following close. Jaime mulled over the threat. He believed it. The king in the north had no love lost for House Lannister, and if Tywin tried some trick, Jaime would pay the price with his life. He felt an odd swirl of fear and confidence. The fear was natural, but the confidence stemmed from knowing Tywin Lannister's unwavering devotion to preserving the family line. Jaime was worth more alive than dead. That alone might shield him from the worst. Whether it would help the Stark girls was another question entirely. They pressed on. The northern route was increasingly desolate, as if villages had been abandoned or ruined in prior campaigning. Old battlefields, grown over with weeds, dotted the plains. Broken spears jutted from the earth. Wolves howled at night, distant but haunting. Even gray wind seemed agitated. On more than one occasion, the direwolf stood with ears pricked, hackles raised, staring into the gloom beyond the torchlight. The Northmen tightened their watch. Jaime heard quiet speculation that roving packs of feral hounds or outlaws might lurk nearby, waiting for a chance to strike. On the third night along that road, the watchman's horn sounded an alarm. Jaime jerked awake inside the small enclosure where he was kept, chains biting into his ankles. Shouts rippled through the camp. Men scrambled for their swords, half-dressed, curses echoing in the dark. Over the noise, Jaime could make out the thunder of hoofs. An ambush? Bandits? He pulled futilely at his chains, wishing for a weapon. Any chance at survival, let alone escape, depended on the chaos outside. Brienne, in the adjacent enclosure, called through the canvas, "Jaime? Do you hear?" A crash interrupted her as horsemen tore through the perimeter. Jaime glimpsed them through a gap in the tent's flaps, riders with no clear sigil, clad in ragged mail, faces half concealed. They howled like wolves, swords flashing in the moonlight. Northmen engaged them, steel ringing. The clash of men and horses shook the air. Grey Wind's furious snarl rose above the din, followed by panicked whinnies. A guard rushed inside to release Jaime from the post, presumably to move him or protect the valuable hostage. Before he could unlock the chains, a raider burst in behind him, plunging a sword through the guard's back. The man gurgled, dropping the key. The raider yanked the blade free, spraying blood across the canvas. Jaime lurched backward, still tethered, searching desperately for anything to defend himself. The raider turned toward him, a wild grin on his scarred face. "Kingslayer," the man hissed, recognizing Jaime's golden hair and the remnants of Lannister finery. "There's a bounty on your head, alive or dead. I think I'll try for alive. The bastard of Bolton pays well for Lannister scum." Jaime felt a cold shock. So these were mercenaries or outlaws loyal to House Bolton, or at least to Ramsay Snow, Roose Bolton's bastard, rumored to be a monster. Perhaps Bolton's alliance with the North was fracturing even further, or perhaps these men simply served whoever paid best. He gritted his teeth, scanning for the fallen guard's sword. It was pinned beneath the guard's body. The key lay a foot away, glinting with fresh blood. The raider advanced, sword raised. There was no time for dignity. Jaime lurched sideways, dropping to his knees so he could grab the key. The chain attached to his ankles barely gave him enough slack. The raider sneered, stepping closer, likely savoring the kill. Jaime fumbled with the key, slick with blood, trying to jam it into the lock on his ankle chain. The raider's sword sided down. Jaime threw himself flat, the blade slicing the air above his head. With a frantic twist, he wrenched the lock open. The chain fell away from his ankles. Still on his knees, Jaime grasped the guard's sword hilt and pulled with all his might. The dead weight resisted, the guard's body limp. He yanked again, the weapon slid free, but the raider's next blow was already descending. Steel met steel in a spray of sparks. The impact rattled Jaime's bones, but he held firm, deflecting the strike. The raider snarled. Jaime pivoted on his knees, hooking the raider's ankle with the guard's chain on the ground. The man stumbled, cursing, and Jaime seized the chance to thrust upward. Shackled wrists limited the angle of his strike, but the blade found flesh in the raider's thigh. Blood soaked into ragged breeches. The raider howled, staggering back. Jaime rose awkwardly to his feet, sword clenched in both manacled hands. The raider came at him again, though slower now. Jaime slid sideways, letting the attacker's momentum drive him forward. He brought the sword down across the raider's back, cutting deep. The man collapsed with a scream. Jaime forced himself not to think about how savage it was he'd done worse in battle. Quick kills were mercy in war. He stumbled outside, heart pounding. Chaos reigned. Tents burned, men grappled in the flickering light. Somewhere in the swirl, Brienne had fought her way free. Jaime caught sight of her formidable figure, an improvised axe in hand, splitting a raider's shield. Her hair whipped around her face, expression determined. A second raider lunged at her with a spear, but she knocked it aside and cracked his skull with the axe's blunt side. Then her gaze flicked toward Jaime. He saw her chest heave in relief that he was still alive. He scanned the battlefield. Robb Stark and his dire wolf were in the thick of it, gray wind tearing a raider from his saddle. The sounds were feral, horrifying. Northmen tried to regroup and push the raiders back. Over the cacophony, Jaime heard calls about capturing the Kingslayer. Bolton, Frey, no one seemed certain. The lines between friend and foe blurred in the anarchy. Jaime spied a fallen riderless horse nearby, pinned beneath a collapsed tent. If he could free the animal, he might flee in the chaos. A part of him flared with the temptation to run, to slip away from both Starks and raiders alike. He owed nothing to these men who had chained him. Yet he hesitated. The possibility of fleeing alone into war-torn lands with no supplies, no allies, was not so appealing. Moreover, he thought of Brienne. She was still bound by her vow to see Sansa returned. If he vanished, Sansa's fate would be sealed. He cursed himself, not entirely sure why he found that vow so compelling. Instead of running, he tried to help the Northmen repulse the raiders. With Brienne's aid, he cut through the chaos, parrying wild blows from men who recognized the golden lion on his tattered cloak. Some shouted curses, others lunged in hopes of slaying the infamous Kingslayer. But shackled or not, Jaime Lannister was still a force with a blade in his hand. He fought with the deadly precision that had once made him the youngest member of the King's Guard in history. His wrists ached from the manacles, but he pivoted and slashed with brutal economy. Each movement aimed to kill or incapacitate swiftly. He lost track of time in the frenzy of motion. Screams mingled with the roar of flames. At some point, the Northmen gained the upper hand. Their greater numbers and discipline paid off, and the raiders, seeing no easy victory, began to retreat. Horses galloped off into the darkness, carrying wounded or desperate men. A few stragglers were cut down by gray wind, who chased them past the perimeter. Then, abruptly, it was over. The camp stood in shambles, bodies littering the ground. Smoke curled from smoldering tents. Night seemed darker still, as though the stars had fled in horror. Catelyn Stark emerged, shaken but unharmed. from behind a turned-over wagon. Robb Stark, spattered in blood, knelt by some of his wounded men. Brienne lowered her axe, chest heaving, scanning for any fresh threats. Jaime let out a long breath, dropping the sword from his exhausted arms. Blood dripped from its point, forming small puddles in the mud. A ring of Northmen closed in, weapons half-raised. They stared at Jaime, uncertain whether to strike him down or thank him. He raised his hands slowly, showing he still wore their manacles. "I fought with you," he said, voice rasping with exertion. "Shall I be repaid with a spear through the heart?" Robb Stark stood, summoning what authority he had left after the brutal skirmish. "Hold your blades," he ordered the men. "He may be our prisoner, but he did not abandon us to the enemy. Nor did Brienne." His gaze flicked to her. "Perhaps my mother was right about your oath." They took stock of the casualties. Dozens of Northmen had been slain or wounded, and at least half that number of raiders lay dead. No one recognized a specific banner among the attackers. Robb cursed them as brigands, but Jaime had heard enough in the fray to suspect a connection to the Boltons. This might have been an unsanctioned strike by vengeful men who wanted to capture or kill the Kingslayer for ransom. Or it might have been part of Roose Bolton's broader betrayal. Jaime didn't voice his suspicions yet. He needed more certainty. The night passed in grim recovery. The wounded were tended to as best as possible, the dead laid out under torn tents. Brienne and Jaime remained under guard, though the hostility toward them had lessened. A few men muttered that if the Kingslayer had tried to flee, who could have blamed him? But he hadn't. That raised questions in their minds. Perhaps he had some honor after all. Jaime found no comfort in their grudging respect. He simply felt exhausted. They pressed on come morning. The camp was intact. Heirs, but leaving quickly was deemed safer than lingering lest more raiders arrive. 2 more days of hard travel brought them within sight of the twins, those matching gray towers that loomed on opposite sides of the Green Fork. Tension crackled in the air. No one trusted Walder Frey, but necessity demanded they treat with him. Scouts rode ahead to announce their arrival. Walder Frey did not greet them personally, of course. Instead, one of his swarm of progeny, a young man with watery eyes, welcomed them at the gate with stiff courtesy. Jaime's manacles clinked as the Northmen paraded him through the courtyard. The place was austere, though the smell of fresh bread from the kitchen suggested the Freys ate well enough. Guards in patched livery eyed the newcomers, especially the dire wolf who rumbled at their approach. Robb and Catelyn conferred with Frey representatives behind closed doors, finalizing the arrangements for the parley. Jaime and Brienne were escorted to the base of the eastern tower, where cramped quarters had been hastily prepared. 2 floors above them, the Freys insisted, were rooms for Robb Stark's party, ensuring that no single group could dominate the keep. It felt more like a standoff than a welcome. Walder Frey was nowhere in sight, hidden away in his high seat, letting his offspring manage the pleasantries. Jaime was exhausted and starved by the time he was shown to his cell in the tower. Unlike a true dungeon, the room had a small window and a straw mattress. Iron bars still lined the door, but at least it was a respite from the endless mud and biting wind. Brienne was taken to a separate chamber down the hall. Jaime watched her go, noticing how she limped slightly from the last fight. The memory of her fierce defense flickered in his mind. He hoped the guards would not try anything untoward, given the Frey's reputation, but he was in no position to protest. Night fell. Torches outside the narrow window cast dancing shadows across the chamber. Jaime dozed fitfully, manacles still binding his wrists, though they'd slackened the chain to let him at least shift position. At some point in the darkness, he heard distant voices in the corridor. Footsteps approached. He tensed, unsure what to expect. The door creaked open, revealing none other than Catelyn Stark. She carried a small lantern, her face etched with fatigue, the bruised circles under her eyes betraying sleepless nights. She motioned to the guards to remain outside. Then she closed the door softly, turning to Jaime. He rose from the straw, leaning against the cold stone wall. For a moment, neither spoke. The lantern light flickered over them, accentuating the lines of sorrow on her cheeks and the faint scars on his face. At last, Catelyn said, "We are told that Lord Tywin has agreed to send a representative to negotiate. He should arrive within a fortnight if the roads are not blocked." A fortnight again, Jaime thought wearily. Everything was measured in fortnights lately, as if the gods found humor in making them wait. "My father rarely delegates if he wants something done right," Jaime said. He might come himself. She shook her head. Our scouts say he's too entrenched in King's Landing. He will send one of his knights, or perhaps Tyrion. I do not know. The Freys have agreed to let us hold the parley in their great hall under the cover of guest right. Jaime's brow lifted. Lord Walder Frey's concept of guest right is tenuous at best. Ask the Tullys and the Starks. He frowned, remembering rumors of a massacre, something spoken in hushed tones. You trust him not to turn on you? A wry, humorless laugh escaped her. I trust no one. But if there is a chance to see my daughters returned, I must take it. Robb, he is a good man, but vengeance gnaws at his heart. His bannermen demand justice for the Karstarks, for the Red Wedding. She stopped herself, eyes clouding with old grief. For the betrayals that cost us so dearly. But I fear every day that Sansa or Arya will be used against us. I cannot rest until I know they're safe. Jaime studied her more closely. She looked thinner than she had in River Run, as if worry had eaten away at her. He almost felt pity. For all her steely resolve, she was a mother fearful for her children's lives, and that desperation had forced her into a devil's bargain with the man who pushed her son from a tower. The irony was not lost on either of them. Quietly, he said, if my father wants me free, and he does, he'll ensure Sansa is returned. One does not spurn Tywin Lannister's demands lightly, even if that person is King Joffrey. Whether Arya can be found is another matter. My father might promise to look, but the realm is chaotic. I do not know if she's in the city at all. A tremor went through Catelyn's shoulders. She steadied herself, eyes closed briefly as though bracing against despair. Any crumb of hope is better than none. I have no illusions, Kingslayer. I know your father is as ruthless as they come, but he is also a man who values his family's image. A missing or harmed daughter of House Stark, once promised safety, would wound the Lannisters' standing. Jaime nodded, acknowledging her reasoning. So we wait for the parley. And if it fails? Her eyes opened, glimmering with a pain she did not bother to hide. If it fails, we are all undone. I suspect the Freys might seize the moment to curry favor with whichever side emerges stronger. And the Northmen, the Karstarks, they'll demand your head. I might not be able to stop them, even if I wanted to. He gave a half shrug, the chain clinking. I've always known I might die with a sword in my hand. Or in chains. War is rarely kind to prisoners. She let out a slow breath. I only pray it does not come to that. I must go. Rest, if you can. The next fortnight will be long indeed. With that, she turned and departed, leaving Jaime alone in the flicker of the lantern's afterglow. He sank back to the straw, mind churning. The next morning, the routine of captivity resumed. Guards brought him bread and water, sometimes a bowl of thin stew. Time stretched, marked by little but the changing shifts of men posted outside his door. Now and then, he caught glimpses of Brienne being led down the corridor under guard, presumably for questioning or to share news with Catelyn. The rumor was that Robb insisted on gleaning all the details of their captivity, their journey, and the attempt on Jaime's life by those raiders. Brienne answered truthfully, as far as Jaime could tell, but no further violence came of it. The days remained still, as if all the realm held its breath for the parley to begin. Then, a minor stir in the courtyard one afternoon signaled the arrival of a party from King's Landing. Jaime stood at the narrow window, craning his neck. He saw a line of riders wearing crimson cloaks, flanked by footmen. Even from a distance, he recognized the tall frame and thinning blonde hair of Ser Kevan Lannister, his uncle. Tywin had not come in person after all. Jaime felt an odd pang of disappointment mixed with relief. Kevan was no fool, but he lacked Tywin's imposing presence. Would that diminish their negotiating power? Possibly. But Kevan was loyal and would strive to carry out Tywin's orders exactly. That meant some measure of security for Jaime. Alongside Kevan rode several knights in Lannister livery. Jaime recognized Ser Adam Marbrand, an able cavalry commander and a longtime retainer of their house. A few more figures trailed behind, escorted by Walder Frey's men into the courtyard. He strained to see if Tyrion was among them, but from his vantage, he could not distinguish a dwarf in the group. It seemed Tyrion had stayed behind, either still serving as Master of Coin in King's Landing or otherwise occupied. Jaime felt a flicker of regret. Tyrion's wit would have been an asset in the negotiations. As evening fell, Jaime remained shut away, listening to echoes in the tower. Doors slammed below, voices argued in the hall. The freed men, Walder Frey's brood, whispered about the forthcoming feast. Guest right demanded that both sides share bread and salt before the parley, ensuring no violence would sully Lord Walder's hospitality. That notion made Jaime smirk. House Frey's butchery at the Red Wedding had proven how hollow their notion of guest right truly was. Still, both sides would observe the formalities. At length, a jailer opened Jaime's door and gestured for him to step out. "You'll be brought to the great hall for the feast," the guard said, a hint of disdain in his voice. "Lord Frey wishes both sides to break bread under his roof. Don't try anything clever, Kingslayer. We'll have archers ringed around the hall." Jaime lifted his manacled wrists. "As you can see, I'm hardly in a position to cause trouble." They led him downstairs, the torchlit corridors twisting through the tower into a covered walkway that stretched over the rushing waters of the Green Fork. He glimpsed the swirling current below through arrow slits in the stone. The sound of the river pounding against the base of the structure seemed to mirror the pounding of his heart. He knew how precarious this all was. An assassination attempt, a sudden betrayal, any spark could light the tinder. The walkway opened into the central keep. The Great Hall of the Twins was not as grand as that of the Red Keep or even River Run, but it was broad enough to accommodate a large gathering. Great trestle tables filled the space, lit by rows of smoky torches. The banners of House Frey hung from the rafters, two towers on a field of pale gray. Mixed among them were the dire wolf of House Stark and the golden lion of House Lannister, though that lion banner was displayed more grudgingly, as if Walder Frey despised showing any courtesy to outsiders. A hush fell as Jaime was escorted in. He saw Catelyn and Robb at the high table, flanked by lords of the north. Kevan Lannister stood across the table, speaking quietly with a sour-faced Walder Frey. The old lord was hunched in his seat, watery eyes flicking about. Several of his children and grandchildren filled the benches around him, a swarm of Freys, each with their own cunning glint. Jaime sensed an undercurrent of hostility directed in all directions, toward the Starks who had once broken faith, toward the Lannisters who threatened Frey interests, and perhaps toward the entire realm for failing to give House Frey more respect. He was led to a table set below the high dais, where a seat awaited him. Brienne was already there, stern-faced, surrounded by watchful soldiers. Kevan Lannister glanced at Jaime and offered a small nod of recognition. That, at least, was something like familial warmth in this frigid meeting. Catelyn and Robb regarded Jaime in silence. There would be no words of greeting from them. He found himself wishing Tyrion were present, if only to break the tension with a well-placed quip. The feast began with the serving of bread and salt, that ancient ritual of guest right. Each side partook, making a show of courtesy. Walder Frey uttered a mocking benediction about how under his roof no blood would be spilled. Jaime's mouth twisted with the memory that House Frey had once spilled rivers of blood under that same roof. Still, the forms had to be observed. The bread tasted stale and the salt was coarse, but it sealed the vow of hospitality for the night. Food arrived in courses: roast mutton, soggy vegetables, watery ale. Clearly, Walder Frey was not eager to lavish his guests with King's Landing finery. Yet no one complained. Their appetite for politics overshadowed any concern about the quality of the meal. Jaime saw Kevan Lannister sipping ale cautiously, eyeing the Freys for any sign of betrayal. Robb Stark poked at his meat with clear disinterest, occasionally whispering to Catelyn. Brienne ate sparingly, watchful. Jaime himself managed a few bites, more out of caution than hunger. Amid the forced civility, Walder Frey finally stood, tapping a cane on the floor to demand silence. His voice grated like a door hinge in need of oil. "We gather here, in the spirit of reconciliation, that House Stark and House Lannister may speak plainly and end the strife that has plagued our realm. I, Walder Frey, offer you my hall for your parley, provided you respect our laws of hospitality." He paused, letting his gaze sweep around. "May the gods punish any who break bread and then break trust." No one spoke in the hush that followed. Jaime thought the words dripped with hypocrisy, but he kept his tongue still. Walder Frey slowly lowered himself back into his seat. Robb Stark rose, head held high. "I thank you, Lord Frey, for hosting this meeting. My father died at the hands of King Joffrey, and the North has been embroiled in war ever since. Let us see if House Lannister will hear reason." Kevan Lannister stood then, clearing his throat. He was more diplomatic than Tywin, lacking the same stony ferocity, but he commanded attention with a calm presence. "House Lannister regrets the strife that has swept these lands. My brother, Lord Tywin, wishes an end to bloodshed if a favorable agreement can be reached. He sends me to negotiate for the release of my nephew, Jaime, and for peace between our houses." Robb's expression hardened. "Peace requires the return of my sisters, Sansa and Arya." and justice for the Northmen slain, my father, my bannermen, my brother who was crippled." His voice did not waver, though sorrow lurked beneath it. Kevin dipped his head. "The release of the Lady Sansa is feasible. She remains in King's Landing as a ward of the crown, though betrothal negotiations have changed with the new alliance to House Tyrell. As for Arya, her whereabouts are unknown to us. Lord Tywin can pledge all resources to finding her, but no promise can be made if she is not in the crown's custody." A ripple of tense murmurs ran through the assembled Northmen. Catelyn set down her goblet with trembling hands. Robb's fist tightened on the table. Jaime observed Kevin's measured tone, how he carefully avoided mention of actual guilt or innocence. This was purely a political dance. "What of justice?" demanded one of the Karstarks in the crowd. "We lost brothers and sons to Lannister swords. Your mountain burned our villages." Kevin's face remained placid. Gregor Clegane and his men acted without official sanction during certain raids. They have been difficult to control. He paused. "We can discuss reparations. Lands, gold, perhaps even new alliances." The talk spiraled into a swirl of demands and counteroffers. Jaime listened, half in a daze. He caught glimpses of Brienne's jaw clenched in frustration. She, like Catelyn, only truly cared about Sansa and Arya. The rest was a tapestry of petty feuds and old hatreds. Walder Frey interjected now and then, complaining of broken vows and insults to his house, insinuating that if the Starks would arrange a certain marriage or cede certain privileges at the crossing, he might be more cooperative. Even Kevin, usually polite, grew tired of the old man's whining. Robb tried to keep his composure, but the mention of marriages stung him, recalling his own broken pact with a Frey daughter. The entire negotiation threatened to collapse under the weight of mistrust. Eventually, Walder Frey clapped his hands sharply. "Enough for tonight. We have observed guest right. Let each side retire. The real bargaining can continue on the morrow, free of wine and empty stomachs." No one seemed inclined to argue. The men rose, stiff from hours of forced civility. Frey guards and Stark soldiers escorted Jaime and Brienne back to the tower. Kevin Lannister disappeared with one of Walder's sons, presumably to take lodging in the other tower, well away from the Starks. Precarious arrangement, indeed. Jaime let out a breath he'd been holding. This was a far cry from the pomp of King's Landing negotiations. Everything here felt teetering, as if the slightest push would send them into bloodshed. That night, Jaime could not sleep. He paced the small chamber, ignoring his body's exhaustion. He recalled Kevin's words. Sansa's release was feasible. Joffrey's betrothal to Margaery Tyrell likely meant Sansa was no longer of any use as a royal bride, so handing her over to the Starks cost the Lannisters little. But that did not guarantee Sansa's well-being in the meantime, nor did it find Arya. Would the Starks accept such a partial victory? Or would the war continue until every grievance was avenged? His thoughts drifted to the moment he'd pushed Bran Stark from that window in Winterfell. The boy had discovered Jaime and Cersei in a secret coupling, something that could unravel the entire royal line if revealed. Instinct, fear, and a twisted sense of protectiveness toward his sister had driven Jaime to push that child. He'd told himself it was the only way. Now, after all he'd endured, the enormity of that moment weighed differently on his conscience. But he could never take it back. At dawn, the negotiations resumed, more subdued but still fraught. The elders hashed out the details, while Jaime remained mostly silent at his table, overshadowed by guards. A small measure of progress emerged. Kevin Lannister formally pledged that Sansa Stark would be escorted north, unharmed, once Jaime was returned to Lannister hands. In exchange, the North would release Jaime and vow to end open hostilities with House Lannister, though the matter of the Iron Islands and the Boltons complicating affairs remained. Arya Stark's fate was an open question. Kevin promised that if she was located, she would be reunited with her family. There was talk of hostages, Edmure Tully or a Karstark scion being sent to King's Landing as a sign of good faith, but that outraged several lords. Night came before they could settle that thorny detail. The second night's feast was no merrier than the first. The mood was tense, the food equally lackluster. Walder Frey gave a grandiose speech about how the crossing was a gift to the realm, ignoring the mountain of gold he demanded from travelers. Jaime watched, bored and anxious, as more empty courtesies flew about. Then, amid the forced politeness, a sudden commotion stirred near the entrance. The doors banged open, revealing a troop of armed men in patchwork cloaks. At their head stood a tall figure with pale eyes, Roose Bolton, his face a mask of polite reserve. A hush fell. The Northmen exchanged wary looks. Robb Stark half rose from his seat, uncertain whether to welcome or condemn this new arrival. Walder Frey glowered, apparently displeased that Bolton had chosen to appear unannounced in his hall. Kevan Lannister's expression darkened as well, having heard of the Boltons' shifting alliances. Roose Bolton stepped forward, inclining his head with measured courtesy. "I trust you will extend guest right to me, Lord Frey, as we are all loyal subjects to King Joffrey now, or do we still speak of the king in the north?" His tone was mild, but the words dripped with insinuation. Robb's fists clenched. "You dare call yourself loyal to Joffrey after swearing yourself to my cause?" Bolton turned to him with a ghost of a smile. "Your cause, your grace, was compromised the moment you lost the Frey's support and let the Greyjoys ravage your coasts. I act solely in the interest of the realm. The North cannot stand alone forever. My father once told me that a swift change of direction can save your life in a storm." He cast a pointed glance toward Jaime. "I hear negotiations are underway to free the Kingslayer." How fortunate for all sides. Tension coiled like a ready spring. Walder Frey, for all his cunning, appeared blindsided. Kevan Lannister cut in, voice tense. "Lord Bolton, does Lord Tywin know you come here?" "In his name." Bolton's pale gaze flicked to Kevan. "He knows I serve the interests of the Iron Throne now, yes. He's aware that the Dreadfort stands ready to uphold the King's peace. But as to whether I come specifically on his behalf, call it initiative. I aim to ensure no more complications arise." He gave Jaime a thin smile. "After all, my men nearly succeeded in retrieving the Kingslayer once before, only to be thwarted." A swirl of realization seized Jaime. So those raiders had indeed been Bolton's men, or at least affiliated with him, trying to deliver Jaime to the Dreadfort. Now Bolton stood here, brazenly sowing discord. Robb's anger was palpable, but the presence of so many armed Bolton soldiers in Frey territory forced him to restrain himself. Walder Frey's voice cracked like a whip. "Very well, I grant you the courtesy of my hall for one night, Lord Bolton. But do not presume to speak for me. My roof, my rules." His watery eyes darted to his own guards, who now shifted uneasily. Bolton inclined his head again. "Gracious as always, Lord Frey." Robb took a breath, then addressed Bolton directly. "If you come as a friend to these talks, you may sit. If not, begone. We have enough trouble without your interference." Bolton's pale lips curved. "I come as neither friend nor foe, your grace. I come as a practical man with a stake in the outcome. The Dreadfort stands in the north, after all, and I would see peace restored, on terms that suit the new order. Let us not forget, House Bolton was once your loyal ally, a faint emphasis on once. We can discuss the details later, if you please." An uneasy calm settled. Servants hastily brought another table for Bolton and his men. The feast resumed, though the appetite for it had soured even further. Jaime felt the electric tension in the air. The negotiations had been complicated enough with Freys and Lannisters. Adding Roose Bolton, a man rumored to flay his enemies, threatened to break the entire precarious arrangement. Yet, the sense that everyone wanted the war to end, or at least wanted to secure their piece of the spoils, seemed to restrain outright violence. Guest right weighed heavily, however hollow it might be in the twins. Morning came. Walder Frey summoned all parties to a final negotiation in the Great Hall, presumably to settle the last points. Jaime arrived under heavy guard, as before. Kevan Lannister and Robb Stark sat opposite each other, with Walder Frey presiding. Roose Bolton took a seat at the table's end, a slight curve on his lips. Brienne stood behind Robb, near Catelyn, stoic and watchful. Her eyes flicked to Jaime once, as if gauging whether he remained steadfast in wanting an accord. The discussion began much like before, Kevan reaffirming House Lannister's willingness to exchange Sansa for Jaime, the Northmen demanding some guarantee of Arya's safety. Bolton interjected that perhaps the Boltons could help locate Arya, as rumors placed her in the Riverlands at one point. Walder Frey sneered, but let him continue. Kevan insisted that any assistance from House Bolton would be welcomed by the crown so long as Bolton reaffirmed loyalty to King Joffrey. Robb bristled at the notion that the North owed anything to Joffrey, but Catelyn's pleading gaze reminded him that Sansa might be returned if he yielded that point. Finally, after hours of tense wrangling, they reached a fragile consensus. House Lannister would release Sansa forthwith, escorting her under guard to a designated meeting point near Moat Cailin to be reunited with her mother. Arya's safe return, if located, would also be guaranteed under separate terms. In exchange, the North and Riverrun lords would release Jaime, granting him safe passage south. The formal cessation of hostilities between the Riverlands and House Lannister hinged on the condition that no further hostilities occurred from the Northmen on the Crown's territories, though the conflict with the Iron Islands was a separate matter. Roose Bolton, in turn, offered to help mediate the transition but demanded recognition from both sides that House Bolton now served the Iron Throne and was owed certain privileges in the North. Walder Frey demanded compensation for bridging rights and some restitution of slights. It was a labyrinth of concessions, but by day's end, the draft of an agreement was in place. Before final signatures or seals could be set, Walder Frey insisted on one last feast that evening to commemorate the forging of peace. The old lord's false smile made Jaime's skin crawl, but it would also offer him a chance to see whether Kevan truly believed in this arrangement's stability. If all went well, Jaime might be a free man by the morrow, riding south in the company of Lannister guards. And Sansa, he allowed himself a moment of relief. Sansa would finally be out of Joffrey's clutches. Arya, well, that remained uncertain, but it was more hope than they'd had in a long while. Dusk arrived. The assembled parties gathered in the hall once more. This time, wine flowed more liberally, as if the tension had eased. Northmen and Freys sat at separate tables, exchanging cautious toasts. Kevan Lannister sat near Jaime with 2 armed knights behind them. Robb Stark, stiff but trying to appear gracious, offered polite words to Walder Frey. Catelyn hovered at her son's side, eyes flicking anxiously between the lords. Brienne stood off to the side, occasionally meeting Jaime's gaze with an unreadable expression. Roose Bolton sipped wine quietly, saying little yet observing everything. Jaime ate sparingly, mindful that trusting anything under Walder Frey's roof was a gamble. But no sign of immediate treachery appeared. The old lord seemed content enough, swirling a cup of wine and muttering half-sincere compliments about how he was pleased to see the realm moving toward peace. Musicians played a somber tune in one corner. The entire scene felt like it wavered on the brink of either concluding the war or reigniting it. At last, Walder Frey stood, cane in hand, motioning for quiet. "We have toiled long for this moment, my lords and ladies," he said, watery eyes drifting over the crowd. "House Stark, House Lannister, even House Bolton, may we lay aside our quarrels for the good of the realm. Let it be known that under my roof we have forged a new chapter in Westeros." He paused, then lifted his wine cup in a toast. "To peace." All eyes rose, cups in hand. Jaime watched warily, but he raised his own goblet. It seemed an end to the bloodshed might truly be near. He noticed Brienne not drinking, though she lifted her cup in a gesture of respect. Robb Stark took a small sip, glancing at his mother. Kevan drank as well, though carefully. Walder Frey took a large gulp, then abruptly coughed, waving a hand. A servant hurried to his side. For a heartbeat, Jaime wondered if the old man was choking. Then Frey cleared his throat, grumbled something unintelligible, and sat back down. The moment passed. As the music resumed, Kevan leaned over to Jaime. "We'll depart at first light," he murmured. "I've arranged a litter for you if needed, but I suspect you'd prefer a horse. In a day's ride, we can be clear of the Freys' domain." Jaime nodded. "What of Robb Stark's men? Will they not hamper us?" Kevan lowered his voice. "They'll stay here a while longer, finalizing details with Lord Bolton and Lord Frey. We'll meet Sansa near Moat Cailin within the fortnight, assuming no duplicity. My men will be vigilant." The notion that he might soon breathe free air, not as a prisoner, made Jaime's heart pound. He tried not to dwell on how easily all this could unravel. One slip, one betrayal, and swords would be drawn. Still, he allowed a flicker of relief. With Sansa freed, perhaps that could be a step toward real peace. He wondered, briefly, if Cersei would welcome such an end, or if she'd find a way to sabotage it out of paranoia. He couldn't be sure, but that would be a problem for another day. Hours ticked on, and the gathering thinned. The mood grew almost jovial in pockets, with men too weary of war to maintain hostility for another night. Jaime saw Robb clasping arms with some of his bannermen, exchanging tired smiles. Walder Frey, slumped on his dais, seemed half asleep. Roose Bolton departed early, his men trailing behind like shadows. Eventually, Kevan squeezed Jaime's shoulder. "Best we go. We'll need rest before dawn. I'll see you at the stables first thing." Jaime rose, grateful to escape the crowd, and allowed himself to be escorted back toward the tower. The corridors were quiet, echoing with distant music from the hall. Brienne followed some steps behind, flanked by Northmen who would guard her for the night. She caught up to Jaime as the retinue paused at a door to let Kevin pass. In a low voice, she spoke. "You'll ride south soon." He glanced at her, seeing the weariness in her eyes. "So it seems. And you? Will Lady Catelyn keep you at her side or send you off again to find Arya?" She hesitated. "I cannot leave my vow unfinished. Sansa may be returned, but Arya, we must keep searching. Lady Stark wants me to continue the quest. Perhaps your father will help, though I doubt it." A wry smile tugged at Jaime's lips. "Tyrion might, if he can muster the resources. He has a soft spot for lost causes. Take care of yourself, Brienne. The realm has a knack for devouring the honorable." She studied his face, something unspoken passing between them. Then she nodded curtly. "And you, Jaime Lannister." The guards pressed them onward. Jaime was led to the same cramped tower chamber, the door locked behind him. He sank onto the straw pallet. Outside, the night was still, save for a breeze whispering past the arrow slit. He closed his eyes, trying to quell the persistent coil of tension in his gut. If all went according to plan, by sunrise he would be free. The war might not be truly ended, but one part of it, his captivity, the constant threat of execution, would be. And somewhere out there, a red-haired girl would be on her way home to her mother if fate allowed. He drifted into a restless sleep. Morning came all too soon with the clamor of boots on stairs. A guard unlocked the door and motioned for Jaime to follow. Down the steps once more, out into the pale dawn light. The courtyard was already alive with the shuffle of men and horses. Kevin Lannister waited by a string of mounts, speaking to 2 Lannister knights. Catelyn Stark stood nearby with Robb, both looking bleary-eyed but resolved. Brienne hovered at the edge, her arms folded. Jaime approached, manacled as always, though the chain was no longer attached to anything. Kevin turned, relief evident on his face. "Nephew, you're ready then?" Jaime nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be. Let's be gone from this place." Robb Stark took a step forward, accompanied by Grey Wind. The dire wolf regarded Jaime with something akin to grudging acceptance, as if it recognized that violence could wait for another day. Robb's voice was measured. "We'll escort you across the river. Then you're on your own until you meet our scouts near Mokalan. If we hear word that my sister is not released, or that you have reneged on any part of the deal, we will hunt you down like a rabid dog." Jaime offered a stiff bow restricted by the shackles. "Understood, Your Grace. I trust my father will keep his word. He wants the war ended as much as you do." Catelyn's face was pale as she came forward. "My daughters, if any harm comes to them," her voice trembled. "You have my word," Jaime said softly, though he doubted it held much currency in her eyes. Still, it was all he could offer. At last, Kevin motioned for a guard to unlock Jaime's manacles. The guard paused, glancing at Robb for confirmation. The young king gave a curt nod. The key turned in the lock, and with a click, the metal restraints fell away, leaving Jaime's wrists free for the first time in what felt like ages. He flexed his hands, wincing at the raw flesh where the iron had bitten. So many months spent dreaming of this moment, and now that it was here, it felt almost surreal. He took the reins of a waiting horse, a tall bay gelding. Mounting gingerly, he surveyed the courtyard from this new vantage, free of chains. The Northmen watched him warily, weapons at the ready, but made no move to hinder him. Kevin and the other Lannister knights mounted as well, forming a protective cluster. Robb Stark signaled, and a small detachment of Stark soldiers led them through the open gates of the twins. The ramparts above were lined with Frey archers, but none raised a bow. Guessed right, it seemed held for now. Crossing the bridge between the twin keeps, Jaime glanced down at the swirling waters below. The wind slapped his face, carrying a sharp tang of damp stone and river current. He drew in a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. He was leaving captivity behind. When they reached the far side, Robb called a halt. He and Catelyn approached one last time, Grey Wind at their heels. Brienne stood a few paces back, as if uncertain of her place. Robb studied Jaime with an inscrutable look. "You know what's at stake. Go. Keep your father to this bargain. For your sake and mine." Jaime nodded. Before he could say more, Catelyn turned to Brienne. "Return to me after you've seen them depart. We must speak of your next task." Brienne inclined her head. Then, seemingly on impulse, she stepped closer to Jaime. Her voice was low enough that only he could hear. "Should you see the Lady Sansa in King's Landing before she departs, protect her, if you can. Even for a little while." A strange warmth touched Jaime's chest. "I will try," he said. He was not a man given to false promises, but something in her eyes demanded an answer. "Farewell, Brienne of Tarth." She gave the barest nod. With that, Jaime nudged his horse forward. Kevin and the knights followed, the Stark detachment watching from behind. The sky stretched out before them, pale blue shot through with wisps of white cloud. The road south lay open, leading toward an uncertain future. Every step of the horse carried Jaime Lannister further from the shadow of the twins, from the chains that had bound him. He flexed his right hand on the reins, grateful he still possessed it to wield a sword should the need arise. Behind him, the war was not truly ended. It raged in the heart of the realm, in the scattered alliances and simmering feuds. Roose Bolton's presence signaled that betrayals would continue to fester. The Freys were far from trustworthy. But for now, Jaime was free. And perhaps with that freedom he could shift the tide in a way that spared at least one innocent girl from the horrors that had consumed them all. He recalled his father's maxim, "A lion does not concern himself with the opinions of the sheep." Yet for the first time, Jaime felt a pang of doubt. Perhaps it was time the lions considered the cost of their roar. They rode on. The rivers and valleys stretched out like a canvas that had been scorched and splattered with blood. Jaime kept a vigilant eye on the horizon, uncertain whether friend or foe might appear. Kevin drew up beside him, offering a tight-lipped smile. "We'll rest soon. You've been through much, nephew." Jaime allowed a faint grin. "I have indeed." The image of Brienne's stern, honest face rose unbidden in his mind. He recalled Catelyn's grief, Robb's fury, Sansa's precarious plight, Arya's unknown fate. So many threads still dangled, weaving through the tapestry of war. But one thread, at least Jaime's captivity, had been cut loose. The road dipped into a shallow glen, the horses' hooves soft on the damp earth. Sunlight broke through the clouds overhead, warming Jaime's shoulders. He realized, with a pang of unexpected clarity, that his old self, cocky, unrepentant, known only as the Kingslayer, might not fit him as comfortably now. The war had reshaped him, tested him, perhaps even tempered him. He was still Jaime Lannister, golden son of Tywin, but he felt the faint stirring of something else inside, something that might yet find the better path. And though he would never say it aloud, he was grateful to have both his hands, for without them, he might never have fought his way through the darkness to this moment of fragile sunrise. He pressed his knees to the horse's flanks, urging it onward. The Lannister knights fell in around him, and Kevin guided them south, toward King's Landing, toward the promises that had been made at the Twins. Soon enough, they would discover if those promises held firm or crumbled under the weight of greed and vengeance. But for now, Jaime rode with his head high, unchained. Where the path led, only time would tell.